And you would think it was one of us who recorded that, but it wasn't. That was an actual lion's roar.
No, that was right after burritos.
Oh, I love that. Love that. That's my favorite part. Daniel in the Deacon's Den. It's time for a conversation with Deacon Dan Brahier. And Deacon Dan, I know you've been serving in parishes for a lot of years, and I bet you get lots of questions from the parishioners, and I understand you've got one you'd like to share.
Good morning. Yes, I do get questions all the time. And it's funny because maybe not surprisingly, there's a theme that there tend to be some questions that I get asked a lot more often than others. And so it occurred to me this last weekend, somebody asked me something, I thought, that comes up all the time. So the question that I got asked was after Mass one day, and one of my parishioners said, why is it that you always distribute the precious blood at Mass? Mm. And she said, shouldn't you be there with the priest in the center distributing the host and leaving precious blood distributing to the lay Eucharistic ministers? Mm-hmm. And I thought, I mean, I hear that a lot. So there's actually kind of two dimensions, because that question goes a lot deeper than it might appear. First and foremost, there's an underlying problem kind of in the theology of the Eucharist. We have to remember that every tiny crumb of a consecrated host in and of itself is the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus. Amen. Yeah. So, if there is a shortage of hosts and there's still a lot of people for communion and we end up having to break the host in half or in quarters, it doesn't matter what the size of the host is that you get. As long as it's a crumb, you still are receiving the body, blood, and soul and divinity of Christ. Mm-hmm. So we believe exactly the same thing about the slightest sip of the precious blood, that it is the same thing. It is the exact same Eucharist, body, blood, soul, and divinity. So I think that what happens sometimes is people see the element of the host, the consecrated bread, as Holy Communion, and that precious blood is kind of like an optional add-on, if you will. And when you view it that way, you start to believe that only an ordained man should be distributing the hosts, because after all, that is the, quote, real Eucharist, and then lay people would distribute the precious blood because that's kind of the add-on. And that is just so not true at all, right? That is an inaccurate way of viewing the Eucharist. Both elements, the body and blood of Christ, the host and the precious blood, are equal. They are the same Eucharist. So, for example, we had a student at the university a couple of years ago who was gluten intolerant, and to a point where even the gluten-free hosts have a little bit of gluten in them, and she was so gluten intolerant she couldn't even take a gluten-free host. So we would always have a special, when she was at Mass, we would have a special chalice on the altar, consecrate another chalice of precious blood and distribute it to her because she couldn't receive the hosts. And when she came to take communion, when she takes a sip of the precious blood, it's every bit as much as receiving communion as everybody else at Mass. So I think that the question sometimes emanates from just like a misunderstanding about the theology of what we're distributing at Mass. But the other piece that also goes really deeply into this is I will always try to explain how deacons are considered custodians of the precious blood. So we have a specific attachment to the precious blood. So here's one to watch for closely at Mass if you've never thought about it or noticed it before. Because if you watch at Mass, here's what the deacon does. The deacon is going to be the one who pours the water and wine into the chalice, and then he hands it to the priest, right? So our first priority is to fill that chalice with the bread and wine, or the water and wine, and hand it to the priest. After the consecration, the first thing the priest does at the end of the Eucharistic prayer is he hands the chalice back to the deacon, because now the deacon had handed it to him as water and wine. The priest is handing it back to you now as precious blood. And so when the priest is elevating the host, the deacon is standing next to him, elevating the cup that now contains the blood of Christ. So again, that attachment to the blood of Christ, we're the ones that are elevating it. And so it makes sense that at communion, then a couple minutes later, when we go to distribute Holy Communion to the congregation, that the deacon would be the one then to take that cup and go distribute it to the congregation. And so at communion, the deacon is distributing the cup while the priest is distributing the host. After communion, then the deacon takes the chalices that still have precious blood in them, consumes any of the remaining precious blood, and then purifies the vessels to make sure that all of the precious blood is removed from them before putting them away. And so it kind of finishes that whole process where we start with the water and wine and we finish by purifying the vessels. So the Eucharistic focus of the deacon at the Mass is always on the precious blood. So in a sense, because of that focus, it really almost doesn't make sense for us to distribute the host. That would be kind of out of character for what we do at the rest of Mass. Now, that doesn't mean that a deacon cannot distribute the host. I'm not saying that at all, because for pastoral reasons, sometimes it makes more like logistical sense for the deacon to distribute the host. So don't be surprised if you see that in some parishes. And in some cases, the precious blood simply isn't offered at all, right? There are only one element. The hosts are being distributed, and so it becomes like a non-issue. So it's not that the deacon is not permitted to distribute hosts. It's just that our role at Mass makes it the preference of the church that we would distribute the cup. And it's almost symbolic in a way. So one of the things that I heard in our formation that really stuck with me is that it's been said that the deacon is the one who gives his blood for the life of the parish. You know, because after all, a deacon is not paid for our ministry, right? Everything we do is volunteer. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, if we're giving our blood for the life of the parish, it makes sense that distributing the cup at Mass is going to be symbolic of how we as deacons are giving our blood to the church. And so we have that connection, that blood connection.
That is interesting, because I'd never heard of deacons being the custodians of the precious blood, and it makes perfect sense. And even when you're not distributing, the precious blood, like when you say sometimes, just there are reasons why just the host is distributed, the Holy Eucharist in the form of the host. There's still, you're still the custodian of the precious blood, and that is still being consumed and consecrated on the altar, even though it's not being distributed to the people.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, and that's why the deacon will always consume the precious blood at the altar, even if it's not distributed to the rest of the congregation. He will always drink from the primary chalice, because that is what he does. That's kind of his connection, if you will, to that.
And Deacon Dan,
once you start to,
I wanted to ask you real quickly, because this is coming up in the mind of a lot of the listeners right now. If that is the case, why aren't all of the parishes presenting the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ under both species?
There are a lot of reasons for that. So some of it is a logistical thing. So, for example, you may not have, there are some parishes that just simply don't have enough lay Eucharistic ministers to be able to distribute. I've talked to some pastors that say, we can only get one or two people to just help distribute communion at Mass, and we would need to have 4 or 5 to be able to distribute cups, and we just can't come up with that many people at a particular Mass or at all, which is unfortunate. It would be nice if people came forward to be able to do that, but that is a reality. Another is that sometimes it is a kind of, especially if you're in the middle of the flu season, and sometimes we will not distribute the cup just out of caution, make sure that nobody's going to get sick. Although the caution is interesting, because it's really more a matter of it's passed more by hand than it is by mouth. But,
right.
But sometimes that's a factor. And another is that in some parishes, people just don't understand the theology of the precious blood well enough, and the pastors don't feel as though their congregation really gets it well enough yet to be able to distribute the cup. So there's lots of things that are possible.
Yeah. Love the explanation, and obviously there's so much involved in Mass that goes on right in front of us that we don't know the particulars of. Thanks for unfolding that one for us.
You're welcome. And we'll talk another time about some other things. There's a lot of things symbolically that a deacon does at Mass that the average person would never even think about or notice, that have everything to do with the ministry that we're called to do. So we'll come back.
The more we know, the better. Deacon Dan Brahier, thank you so much. Have a wonderful day.
You too. Thank you.